The day Ethan Cole vanished, the Louisiana swamplands swallowed not just a man, but decades of unanswered questions and silent grief. This is not a story built from rumor or dressed up in sensational headlines. This is the carefully reconstructed truth that his family and friends have fought for over 40 years to uncover. Ethan was not just the son of one of Hollywood's most celebrated leading men, Richard Cole. He was a man who walked away from red carpets and studio lights to chase the kind of truth that cannot be staged. What happened to Ethan during his final assignment in the spring of 1970? Why did it take 4 decades for his camera to be found buried deep in the Louisiana wetlands? If you want to uncover the answers to these questions, then like this video and subscribe to my channel, Unscripted Tales, and help us reach 5,000 likes so we can continue bringing you stories that deserve to be told with respect and accuracy. Ethan Cole's life was never meant to be ordinary. Born in 1942, he grew up under the shadow of a father whose name commanded attention everywhere. Richard Cole was the kind of movie star who defined an era, but his son chose not to follow that same path. Ethan's mother, Marilyn Hayes, an actress in her own right, raised him in the quieter landscapes of Oregon after the marriage ended. The boy who could have had the world handed to him on a silver screen instead chose a camera and the untamed reality that came with it. By his 20s, Ethan had traded the security of the film industry for the uncertainty of documenting moments that history books often avoid. His lens was not aimed at glamour, but at truth, no matter how dangerous the pursuit. His assignments took him from city streets during riots to the tense front lines of political standoffs, each image carrying the weight of a man determined to show the world what others tried to hide. Ethan Cole was born in 1942 in Los Angeles, California, into a world where cameras followed his family everywhere. His father, Richard Cole, was a towering figure in Hollywood, known for playing fearless heroes on the silver screen. But Ethan's earliest memories were not of bright lights or cheering crowds. After his parents divorced, much of his childhood was spent far from Los Angeles, living with his mother, Marilyn Hayes, in the quiet towns of Oregon. Marilyn had her own history in film, but she preferred the calmer pace of raising her son in a place where life was measured by the turning of seasons, instead of the ticking of a production clock. As a teenager, Ethan was curious about his father's world. He tried his hand at acting in a few small productions, and for a time it seemed he might walk the same path. Yet, something never fit. The applause felt hollow. The scripts felt too polished, too removed from the world he wanted to understand. He found himself drawn to real stories, the kind where no one knew how the ending would come. That calling took shape when Ethan first picked up a camera. At first, it was a hobby, snapping pictures of street corners, neighbors, and the raw beauty of the Oregon coast. But soon, the lens became his way of making sense of the world. He discovered he could capture a single moment and tell more truth in that frame than in an entire film. By his 20s, his work had already been noticed by editors across the country. Ethan built his reputation the hard way, traveling to places others avoided, documenting conflict and the human cost it left behind. He photographed protests that turned violent, small communities struggling against natural disasters, and quiet moments of resilience in the face of loss. Those who worked with him admired his ability to move through dangerous places with both courage and respect. He was not chasing headlines. He was chasing truth, even when it meant walking into the heart of risk. But the journey that defined him would soon lead to an assignment that was unlike any other he had taken before. One that would place him deep in the Louisiana wetlands where danger waited on every side. By early 1970, Ethan Cole had already earned a reputation as one of the Chronicle's most fearless photographers. He had been to protest lines where police batons swung without warning, to disaster zones where the air carried the scent of smoke and loss, and to backroads where no reporter dared to walk alone. That is why, when tensions began to boil over in the Mississippi River Delta, the editors knew exactly who they would send. The assignment was not just another story. It was a volatile standoff in rural Louisiana, where armed militias and federal agents were locked in a tense and unpredictable battle for control. Weeks of rising hostility had turned small towns into armed camps. Checkpoints lined the highways. Roads disappeared into swamp trails that outsiders could barely navigate. Locals spoke in whispers about shipments that came and went under cover of darkness. Ethan arrived in New Orleans with little more than his cameras, a notebook, and the determination to see beyond the official statements. He worked out of a modest room in the French Quarter, where the noise of the city felt like a distant echo compared to the silence that hung over the swamps. His plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution. Get close enough to the heart of the conflict to capture the truth, and make it out again to tell the story. The Chronicle trusted Ethan, not because he took risks without thought, but because he knew when to step forward and when to disappear into the background. Yet, this time, the danger was unlike anything he had faced before. The Mississippi River Delta was a place where the land itself could turn against you, where waterlogged paths swallowed tire tracks and thick cypress groves hid more than wildlife. It was the kind of place where people could vanish without a trace. What Ethan did not yet know was that this story would not end with a published photograph or a headline. It would pull him into the depths of the swamplands, to a place where cameras rarely returned and where every shadow seemed to hold a secret. On the morning of April 7, 1970, Ethan Cole was drinking black coffee at a small cafe in New Orleans, when a call came through from a local contact. There had been a flare-up near the small town of Bayou Ridge, deep in the swamplands. Reports spoke of gunfire, armed roadblocks, and the kind of confrontation that could change the course of the standoff. For Ethan, it was the kind of moment that could define a career. For anyone else, it was a warning to stay far away. Ethan was not planning to go alone. Mark Dalton, a freelance photographer working for a national magazine, had been covering the same unrest from a different angle. The two men had crossed paths before and shared a mutual respect for each other's work. Mark was known for his quick wit and ability to connect with strangers in tense situations. When Ethan told him about Bayou Ridge, Mark did not hesitate. They arranged for a local driver, a man familiar with the backroads that cut through the swamp like hidden veins. The vehicle was an old mud-stained pickup truck with more dents than paint, the kind that would not draw attention in militia territory. Cameras, film, and a small pack of essentials were all they carried. The plan was to reach the scene, document what was happening, and return to New Orleans by nightfall. The route took them past several police checkpoints. State troopers checked their press credentials, looked over their gear, and warned them about the risk of going any further. The air was heavy with tension, as if even the trees knew trouble was ahead. At one checkpoint, an older trooper stepped closer to Ethan's window and spoke in a low voice, telling them there had been sightings of militia patrols just a few miles up the road. Many had turned back after hearing that. Ethan and Mark simply nodded, thanked the officers, and pressed on. The last recorded sighting of the two men came from those very troopers, watching the truck rumble away into the distance. Ahead lay a stretch of road where the map turned into uncertainty, where official authority ended and militia control began. From that point forward, no one would see Ethan Cole or Mark Dalton alive again. Somewhere beyond those cypress paths, the trail went cold, and the quiet of the swamp swallowed their footsteps. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched long over the bayou, the same pickup truck that had carried Ethan Cole and Mark Dalton toward Bayou Ridge rattled back into the checkpoint. This time, only the driver sat behind the wheel. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the state troopers. He barely spoke above a whisper as he explained what had happened. According to the driver, they had made it as far as an abandoned lumber mill deep in the swamp, a place where the road narrowed and the air grew heavy with stillness. Without warning, armed militia members emerged from the tree line. They were not there to talk. The men surrounded the truck, weapons raised, their faces set with a cold determination. The driver said they ordered Ethan and Mark out of the vehicle. Cameras and gear were seized immediately. Ethan tried to speak, to show his credentials, but his words were ignored. The driver claimed he was told to leave if he wanted to live. In a daze, he started the truck and backed away. The image of Ethan and Mark standing under the shadow of the mill burned into his mind. As he sped back toward the checkpoint, he did not look over his shoulder. Within hours, the state police had passed the report to their higher officers, and the FBI was contacted. Search plans were drawn up quickly, but every official involved understood the danger. The area beyond the mill was not just controlled by militia fighters. It was a maze of waterways, hidden trails, and locals who distrusted any outsider, especially federal agents. Small teams attempted to push into the swamp the next morning, but progress was slow. The waterlogged ground made vehicles useless, and every sound seemed to echo in the trees. Armed lookouts were spotted in the distance, watching their movements. The rescue effort became a tense waiting game, with each hour stretching longer than the last dot by the second day. It was clear that Ethan and Mark had vanished into a place where law and reason no longer held sway, and where the silence of the wetlands hid more than the sounds of nature. News of Ethan Cole's disappearance spread quickly, not only through Louisiana, but across the entire country. It was impossible to ignore the name. Ethan was the son of Richard Cole, a man whose films had filled theaters, and whose face was instantly recognized by millions. Newspapers ran the story alongside photographs of father and son, the headlines heavy with urgency. The Chronicle published a front-page plea for information, and other national outlets followed. The disappearance of a well-known journalist in such mysterious circumstances became a matter of both public fascination and deep concern. The FBI took control of the investigation, sending agents to New Orleans and the surrounding parishes. They fanned out through the Delta, interviewing locals in fishing villages, small towns, and backroad communities. Some people spoke in hushed tones about the militia camps hidden deep in the swamplands. Others claimed that to outsiders matching Ethan and Mark's descriptions had been seen days after their disappearance. Guarded by armed men, the stories conflicted. A few insisted the photographers were executed at the lumber mill on the same day they were taken. Others were certain the men were moved by boat deeper into the wetlands, to a place no map could chart. There were even claims of them being spotted weeks later along hidden waterways. Though none of these accounts could be verified, agents tried to follow every lead, but the deeper they went, the more resistance they faced. Militia sympathizers refused to cooperate. Locals who might have known more avoided the agents entirely, fearing retaliation. The swamp itself seemed to conspire against the search, with its tangled waterways, quicksand pockets, and endless cover of trees. As the months turned into years, the investigation lost momentum. By the late 1970s, the case was no longer a priority. The region had grown even more hostile toward federal presence, and the danger to any search team was greater than ever. Ethan Cole and Mark Dalton remained missing, their trail cold, their fate a question that refused to fade from memory. But the silence would not last forever, because years later, voices from inside those swamps began to speak. For more than a decade, the story of Ethan Cole and Mark Dalton had been little more than a fading headline, kept alive only by the families who refused to forget. Then, in the early 1980s, a sudden ripple disturbed the stillness of the case. Several former militia members were arrested on unrelated charges, and during questioning, fragments of an old secret began to surface. Among these men, two spoke of a hidden camp deep within the swamp, a place few outsiders had ever seen. They claimed that in 1970, two journalists had been brought there under heavy guard. The descriptions they gave matched Ethan and Mark in striking detail. According to their accounts, the men were not killed immediately after their capture. Instead, they were held for months, watched day and night by armed sentries. Other witnesses, former swamp guides and locals who had once been forced to work near militia hideouts, quietly confirmed parts of the story. They said the two journalists endured the punishing heat, the constant swarm of insects, and the sickness that came from drinking water straight from the swamp. Malaria, fever, and malnutrition weakened them slowly. But none of these stories ended with rescue. The witnesses spoke of illness, claiming both men One said Ethan died first, his strength finally giving way. Another swore Mark followed only days later. Their bodies, they believed, were buried in a place no one would stumble upon by accident. Even with these new accounts, the FBI could find no physical evidence. The swamp had erased any clear trail, as if the land itself was determined to guard the secret. The leads reignited interest in the case, but without proof. The mystery still clung to shadows, and yet, beneath those shadows, the truth was still waiting. Sealed away in the heart of the wetlands, from the fragments of testimony gathered in the 1980s, a picture of Ethan Cole and Mark Dalton's final months began to take shape. Witnesses described a small makeshift camp hidden so deep in the swamp that even sunlight seemed hesitant to reach it. The camp was ringed with crude watchtowers, and the air carried the constant hum of insects. Armed men moved between the tents, their eyes always on the prisoners. Ethan and Mark were kept together in a low wooden shelter, its floor damp and rotting from years of swamp moisture. Their meals were sparse, little more than stale bread or boiled roots. The water they drank came straight from the swamp, murky and foul, and it brought sickness that no one cared to treat. Fever left them shivering in the oppressive heat, while swarms of mosquitoes found every inch of exposed skin. Yet in the middle of this misery, Ethan managed to do what no one expected. Somehow, he kept his camera hidden. Witnesses said it was wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath the warped floorboards of their shelter, away from the eyes of their guards. He could not use it openly, but the knowledge that it was there gave him something to hold on to. The guards underestimated how much the two journalists understood of what they were seeing. Ethan and Mark watched as boats arrived under cover of darkness, offloading crates that were carried straight into the camp. From the whispered conversations they overheard, it became clear these were illegal weapons shipments, destined for buyers far beyond the swamp. This was not a small operation. It was part of something larger, something that those in power could never allow to be exposed. It was this knowledge that sealed their fate. The men holding them knew that if Ethan and Mark were ever released, their words and photographs could unravel a web of secrecy stretching far beyond Louisiana. The decision was made quietly, but it was final. These two would never leave the swamp alive. Somewhere out there, the evidence Ethan guarded so fiercely was still waiting to be found, as the months in captivity dragged toward their grim end. The camp's guards began to prepare for what they called a final transfer. Witnesses later said that Ethan and Mark had grown too weak to stand for long periods, their strength eaten away by fever and malnutrition. But even in that state, the guards treated them with the same watchful caution as before. The men knew something dangerous was in those prisoners' heads and, more importantly, hidden among their possessions. In the days before their execution, the order came down to make the evidence vanish completely. Ethan's camera, rolls of film, his notebooks, and even personal items like identification cards and watches were gathered together. Rather than destroy them on the spot, one of the guards, an older man who had served in the swamps for years, chose a different method. He placed everything inside a waterproof crate, sealing it tightly before loading it into a small boat. Under cover of night, he rowed deep into a remote cypress grove where the roots twisted up from the water like a forest of skeletal hands. The place was silent except for the distant splash of unseen creatures. There, he dug into the damp earth and buried the crate beneath a tangle of roots, the swamp water licking at the edges of the hole. Before leaving, the guard sketched a crude map on a scrap of paper, marking the location with a shape only he would recognize, a bent cypress leaning over the water like a bow. Whether he planned to retrieve it later for profit or to keep it hidden forever, no one knew. But he never returned. For decades, the swamp kept its secret, the buried crate waiting in silence for someone to stumble upon it. For nearly 40 years, the truth about Ethan Cole and Mark Dalton lay hidden beneath the murky waters and tangled roots of the Louisiana swamplands. Then, in 2010, a thread appeared in the most unlikely way. A documentary filmmaker was traveling through the Delta, collecting oral histories from those who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of its waters. Most people spoke only of fishing, storms, and the rhythms of the river. But one elderly fisherman told a different kind of story. He leaned forward, as if the swamp itself might be listening, and described a memory from his youth. He remembered seeing two strangers in a militia camp near his fishing routes in 1970, thin, pale, and watched closely by armed men. Years later, he learned they had died there. But what made his story different was the detail he carried with him all this time. He claimed to know where the prisoners' belongings had been buried. The fisherman spoke of a cypress grove far from any marked channel, a place where the trees leaned so close together that sunlight barely touched the water. He described a single, bent cypress, its trunk curved like an archer's bow, standing watch over the site. It was the same image that the guard's crude map had once held. The filmmaker immediately understood the weight of this revelation. He reached out to journalists and historical researchers who had followed Ethan's case for decades. Soon, a small search team was formed. Their goal clear: reach that remote grove and see if the swamp still kept its secret. Permission was secured from local authorities, and preparations began for an excavation in one of the most inaccessible corners of the delta. The team knew it would not be an easy journey. They would have to battle thick vegetation, unstable water channels, and the lingering danger of old traps and hidden hazards. But the chance to uncover what had been lost for 4 decades was worth every risk. Somewhere in that quiet, sun-starved grove, a story frozen in time was waiting to be unearthed. The journey to the grove took 2 days. The team traveled first, by boat, along winding channels that seemed to lead nowhere, then on foot, through knee-deep water and tangled roots that clawed at every step. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, and the silence felt almost deliberate, as if the swamp knew why they had come. When they finally reached the bent cypress, it stood just as the fisherman had described, its curved trunk leaning over the still water like a sentinel from another time. Metal detectors began to sweep the area, their dull hum breaking the quiet. For hours, there was nothing but the occasional crackle of interference. Then, a sharp, clear signal cut through. The digging was slow and careful. Shovels moved aside, layer after layer of damp soil, until something solid emerged from the mud-rusted metal edge. Followed by the shape of a box, the team worked silently, their hands moving with a mix of urgency and reverence. When the box was lifted free and its lid pried open, the first thing they saw was a camera. Its metal body was corroded, its leather casing eaten away by time, but the initials etched into the side were still visible, EC beneath. The camera were other personal effects, fragments of clothing, a watch with its glass cracked, and several rolls of film wrapped in what was once waterproof material. Among them, partially hidden beneath a torn strap, was a single roll of black and white film still loaded inside the camera itself. Near the box, buried deeper in the soil, they uncovered partial human remains. The bones were fragile and discolored by decades underground, but the location and proximity to the personal items left little doubt they belonged to one of the missing men. Everything was documented, sealed, and prepared for careful analysis. The swamp had held on to these pieces for 40 years, but now they were in the hands of those who could finally bring the truth into the light. The camera was taken to a specialized lab where experts in restoring aged and damaged film began their delicate work. Years of moisture and chemical decay had left the roll brittle, the emulsion peeling in places, but there was still a chance that something could be saved. Every step had to be done in near darkness, every movement steady and precise. When the first faint images began to appear, the room fell silent. Grainy and scarred by time, the photographs nonetheless told a story that no words could fully capture. The first few frames showed the camp itself, ramshackle shelters built from rough timber, a perimeter of wire, and figures moving in the background with rifles slung over their shoulders. The swamp seemed to press in on all sides, the trees crowding close, their branches heavy with moss. As the roll progressed, the faces of Ethan and Mark appeared. They were thin, their clothes worn, and their expressions carried the weight of exhaustion. Yet even in those black and white images, there was a spark of resolve. As if the camera had caught the stubborn thread of hope, they refused to let go. One photograph stood out among them all. Ethan sat against the wall of a wooden hut, his shoulders hunched, but in his hands he held a small leather-bound notebook. The edges were frayed, the cover darkened by the damp air. It was clear from the way he held it that it was important, perhaps more important than the camera itself. That notebook, whatever it contained, was not in the box recovered from the grove. Its absence raised as many questions as the photographs answered, and it hinted at another layer of truth still hidden in the swamp's shadows. The search team did not stop after uncovering the camera. They widened the excavation area, probing deeper into the damp earth. Just a few feet from where the box had been buried, a dull metallic glint caught the light. It was a small rusted tin, its lid warped and its sides pitted with age. The tin was sealed tight, and when it was finally pried open, the contents inside were wrapped in layers of cloth, darkened and fragile from decades underground. Inside, they found the missing notebook. Though the leather cover had stiffened and cracked, the pages within were still legible in many places. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp strokes, deliberate lines. It was Ethan Cole's. The first entries spoke of the camp's daily routines, the sickness that swept through the prisoners, and the way the guards moved supplies in and out at night. But as the pages turned, the writing became more urgent. Ethan described watching crates arrive by boat under the cover of darkness. Their contents carefully hidden, but impossible to mistake once unpacked firearms, ammunition, and explosives. He noted the markings on the crates, their origins traced back to suppliers in other states. It was clear the camp was not just a militia outpost, but a hub in an illegal interstate arms trafficking network. Then there were the names. Scrawled in the margins and on separate pages was a list of other journalists who had vanished over the years. Each name carried a note where they had last been seen, what they might have been investigating, and, in some cases, who might have been responsible for their disappearance. Reading it was like opening a ledger of the forgotten. Each entry, a silent accusation against those who had erased these people from public view. The notebook was more than Ethan's account of his own captivity. It was a record of a larger pattern, a map of threats that reached far beyond the swamp, and it confirmed something the photographs alone could not, that their disappearance had been no accident at all. When the camera was examined more closely by restoration experts, they noticed something unusual about its design. The body had been modified. Beneath a false panel, barely visible unless you knew where to look, there was a narrow compartment. Inside it lay a second roll of film, sealed in waxed paper to protect it from moisture. This was no ordinary roll. When it was developed, the images revealed a view of the camp unlike anything in the first batch of photographs. There were clear shots of armed guards, some carrying weapons identical to those Ethan had described in his notebook. Several frames captured crates stacked on wooden platforms, their stenciled markings just visible in the grainy light, markings that matched known suppliers of military-grade equipment. The roll also showed the human side of the camp. Faces of fellow prisoners appeared tired, thin, and wary, but still clinging to scraps of dignity. In one frame, a prisoner was shown carefully stitching a torn shirt under the shade of a cypress tree. In another, a group of captives crouched over a makeshift fire, sharing what little food they had. And then there were the personal moments. A photograph of Ethan and Mark sitting side by side, their shoulders almost touching, the faintest suggestion of a smile on their faces despite the world closing in around them. Another frame showed Mark holding a carved piece of driftwood, a crude little sculpture shaped into a bird, likely a gift from one of the other prisoners. The hidden roll was proof that even in the face of sickness, fear, and the knowledge that they might never leave, Ethan and Mark had continued to document what they saw. They had found ways to preserve both the evidence of crimes and the small fragments of humanity that survived inside that camp. And still, one question lingered: what had become of Mark Dalton himself? The discovery of the hidden roll reignited the search team's determination. If Ethan's belongings and partial remains had been buried here, then there was every reason to believe that Mark Dalton was somewhere close. The team returned to the grove with ground-penetrating radar and more sensitive metal detectors, expanding the search radius in careful, deliberate sections. Days of work passed before they found another signal, this one about 50 meters from the original site. The soil here was darker, wetter, and more compacted, as if it had been disturbed long ago and then left untouched for decades. When they began to dig, the first items to appear were fragments of fabric, their colors muted and faded by years underground. A rusted metal badge followed, the lettering too corroded to read until it was gently cleaned on site. The moment the dirt cleared from its surface, the words became visible press identification. And beneath it, the name Mark Dalton. Not far from the badge, the team uncovered skeletal remains. Though time had worn them down, enough detail remained for forensic experts to later confirm that they belonged to Mark. He had been buried with care similar to Ethan. His resting place chosen deep within the grove's shadows, hidden from the world. Finding Mark's press credentials beside him left no doubt. Both men had met their end here, their stories tied together until the swamp itself released them. The two photographers who had set out side by side had not been separated in death. And now, finally, they were no longer lost. Yet there was still one piece of the puzzle that no one had been able to find: the final evidence Ethan had risked everything to preserve. Months after the discovery in the grove, when the story had already spread through newspapers and history programs, an unexpected message reached the investigative team. It came from a man in Texas, now in his 70s, who claimed that he had been a prisoner in the same swamp camp as Ethan Cole and Mark Dalton. His voice was steady but heavy, as if he had been carrying the weight of his secret for a lifetime. He told them that shortly before Ethan was taken away for the last time, the photographer had entrusted him with a small package. Wrapped in layers of cloth and sealed with wax, it contained a single roll of film. Ethan had pressed it into his hands, with quiet urgency, telling him that if he ever made it out alive, he should ensure the film reached the outside world. The man had escaped years later, during the chaos, when militia forces scattered, but fear of retribution kept him silent. For decades, the package remained hidden in a box in his home, unopened and untouched. But when he saw the news about Ethan's camera being found, he knew the time had come to hand it over. When the roll was developed, the images were shocking. They were sharper than any others recovered so far, capturing the militia's operations with undeniable clarity. There were photographs of smuggled weapons being loaded into unmarked boats, meetings between armed men and individuals in expensive suits, and faces that were not supposed to be there at all: local officials, business owners, and political figures who had publicly denied any connection to the militia. It was the kind of evidence that could not be explained away. Ethan had risked everything to make sure these photographs survived, and now they were in the hands of those who could expose the truth. But within that roll were also images of a very different kind, moments that revealed another side to life inside the camp. Among the images on the roll given by the former prisoner, there were several that immediately drew the team's attention. They were not photographs of weapons or militia leaders, nor of political meetings in shadowed corners. These were quieter, more personal frames, clues, shots of pieces of paper laid out on a rough wooden table. The edges curling from humidity, were letters. Some were written in Ethan's own hand, his script steady despite the conditions, while others bore the handwriting of fellow prisoners. Each letter carried messages meant for families far away, words of love, regret, and hope. In Ethan's letter, he spoke of his parents, of his decision to pursue truth through photography, and of his belief that even if he did not survive, the world would one day know what had happened in that swamp. He urged whoever found his words to finish what he could not. One letter was addressed to the family of a journalist who had vanished years earlier in Central America. Another was written to a wife in Ohio, describing the camp's location as best as memory allowed. These letters not only gave closure to families who had lived for decades with uncertainty, but they also revealed names, dates, and events that matched unsolved disappearances in multiple states. Investigators realized these were more than farewells, they were leads, carefully woven into the lines by people who knew they might not live to see justice. And in one of Ethan's final notes, there was a cryptic reference to something hidden beyond the grove, a place he called the second vault. As the letters were carefully catalogued and cross-referenced, one in particular stunned everyone who read it. It was not addressed to a family or a friend. Instead, it was written almost like a confession, signed by someone whose name carried weight far beyond the swamp. The handwriting belonged to a man who had, at the time of the camp's operation, been a high-ranking state official. In public, he was known for his strict stance against lawlessness and his repeated calls for federal crackdowns on militia activity. But in this letter, his own words unraveled that image completely. He described being at the camp on multiple occasions, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. He admitted to helping arrange shipments of weapons under the guise of military surplus, directing them through the swamp for distribution to groups that could be used for political leverage. He named associates in business and government who profited from these deals and hinted at favors exchanged for silence. Most damning of all, he confessed to witnessing the moment Ethan and Mark were sentenced to die. He wrote that their photographs were too dangerous, their knowledge too deep, and that the order to end their lives had not come from the militia alone. It had been approved by figures in positions of power who feared exposure. The letter was not just an insight into corruption, it was an open door to decades of buried secrets, the kind that could topple reputations and rewrite history. And yet, there was still the lingering mystery of what Ethan meant by the second vault. In the years that followed the recovery of Ethan's final work, his family sought a way to ensure that his sacrifice would not fade into the quiet pages of history. With the support of friends, former colleagues, and other families who had also lost loved ones in the line of duty, they established the Cole Foundation. Its mission was clear: to provide safety resources, legal support, and emergency aid to journalists working in the most dangerous corners of the world. Every grant, every training session, carried Ethan's name, as a reminder that truth often comes at a cost, and that those who chase it should never be left unprotected. Ethan's camera, along with the photographs recovered from the swamp, found a permanent home in the National Museum of American History. Visitors stood before the display in silence, reading about the man who turned away from the bright lights of Hollywood to walk into war zones and hostile lands armed only with a lens and a fierce belief in the power of storytelling. The images, some haunting, some defiant, now spoke to millions who would never have known his name otherwise. The revelations from the case sparked sweeping reforms in how missing journalist investigations were handled. Federal protocols were tightened, coordination between agencies improved, and specialized units were created to respond faster when a reporter vanished. Officials acknowledged, quietly but publicly, that if such measures had existed in 1970, Ethan and Mark's fate might have been different, though time continued to move forward. Ethan Cole's story became more than a tragedy. It became a standard of courage, a call to action, and a reminder that even in the darkest places, truth can survive if someone is willing to carry it. If you are still here watching this story, it means it has reached you. This story deserves your like and subscribe. And please help me reach 5,000 likes, because this is a challenge from my mother, so help me guys, it is totally free. And tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this story.